Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar series featuring guest interviews hosted by the Forum's project directors. My name is Benjamin Baird. I currently lead the Forum's advocacy efforts, and I'll be your host today in a stimulating look back at the early years of the Iraq War with our very special guest, Ambassador L. Paul Bremer. Mr. Bremer was the first administrator of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq from 2003 to 2004, and made many of the key decisions affecting the country's future. Formerly a Foreign Service officer, he has held various domestic posts with the U.S. State Department, including the coordinator at the Bureau of Counterterrorism. He is the author of My Year in Iraq, The Struggle to Build a Future of Hope. Thank you, Mr. Bremer, for joining us today.
Nice to be with you, Ben. Good to see you looking well. Before we launch off, I thought it'd be useful to say a couple of things about the situation in Iraq overall, the strategic situation, and in particular what my directions were from President Bush. Iraq was, and we can discuss that in more detail, basically a shattered country, politically, economically, and morally. They had been under this brutal dictator for decades, and that had real implications for the latitude, the kind of problems we were going to have to address. So from the president, I got basically two directions. My job was to help the Iraqis recover control of their own country because they'd been under a dictatorship, and that meant control politically and economically. And try to put them, second command from the president was to put the Iraqis on a path towards representative or democratic government. So in our discussion today, it's important to keep those points in place. This was a shattered country, and I had two jobs I had to try to get them done. In particular, move them on a path towards representative government.
Thank you. I think that's very important context, so thank you for that. I'll jump in with my first question here. A bright moment in the Iraq War, your announcement of the capture of Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. It's an iconic moment in American history. After years of failing to locate and capture Osama bin Laden, the news really of capturing Saddam Hussein was a morale booster for the American public and our Iraqi partners. Our audience may recall your three words, "We got him," when remembering the moment they learned about Saddam's capture. But as the political authority in Iraq, when and how did you learn about Saddam's apprehension?
Well, at first, it was a long, hard search. We looked, particularly the U.S. military was on the lookout for him. We kept getting rumors that he was driving a taxi cab in Baghdad or he was some other country. We never knew until I think it was a Saturday morning in December of 2003. They began to get a little closer. And at about midnight Baghdad time, that Saturday to Sunday, December 13th, I think it was, I was told that I had my security detail said I had a telephone call back at my office on a secure phone. Anyway, we had to put a motorcade together and get back to my office. We got there about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I had a call from General John Abizaid, who was the commander of the forces in Iraq, saying, "We think we have captured Saddam Hussein." Now, there were several problems. First of all, was how were we going to be sure we got him, that it was him, because we knew he used doubles. So they had done a preliminary inspection with some scars or markings that they knew Saddam had, and those checked out. But Abizaid and I agreed it was important to get the suspect from where he was caught, which was in the northern town of Tikrit, back down to Baghdad, where we could put him in front of some Iraqis who could definitively confirm this was Saddam Hussein. And so that's what we did. We kept it secret. We got him down to Baghdad that early that morning, maybe 4 o'clock in the morning. Showed him to his former vice president, who was one of our high value prisoners who thought this was Saddam Hussein. But we also needed to try to get a DNA test to confirm, that that's who he was. The problem with that was that the nearest place we had the DNA lab that could do the examination was in Germany. And Abizaid and I agreed there was no way we could hold this secret. So in any case, we decided we would have a joint press conference. I would do that with the commander of the forces in Iraq, General Sanchez. And that's when I was sitting backstage. We knew there was a very crowded auditorium with literally hundreds of journalists from all over the world. And one of my British associates said, I said to him, you speak Arabic. What is an appropriate thing to say? And he said, well, why don't you just never mind the Arabic? Just say you got him. So it was his idea. And I went out and said, ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
I see. And that it's quite an iconic phrase that's been repeated. I think it's even an internet meme. It's been used online in movies, quite a moment. So after early victories in OIF, Operation Iraqi Freedom, an insurgency was formed that challenged both coalition forces and the legitimacy of the Iraqi government. Today, many politicians and journalists, or at least some, blame coalition provisional authority policies implemented very early on as the primary catalyst behind the insurgency and the slow pace of reconstruction in Iraq. Of course, I'm talking about CPA order number 1, debathification, which you mentioned, and CPA order number 2, which effectively dismantled the Iraqi military. So let's start again, go back to debathification. Why was this necessary for a free and stable Iraq? And did this order strip Iraq of the bureaucratic know-how, the experience necessary to rebuild the country, as critics claim?
Okay, well, let's go through this. Let's remember that the Ba'ath Party was consciously and publicly modeled on the Nazi Party when it was founded at the end of World War II. And it had the same practices as Hitler's Nazi Party had. It ruled by brutality, cruelty, torture, and summary justice. So most Iraqis in 2003 had never had an experience living with a democracy. We have to remember how hard it was going to be, and we'll come back to that later, I'm sure, to build out an under structure for democratic life. The Ba'ath Party had been condemned by the Department of State before the war ever happened, and the Department of State had stated in a study they did with Iraqis, thousands of Iraqis, that there could be no place in a free Iraq for the Ba'ath Party, given its history. Now, we estimate, our intelligence service has estimated that about 10% of Iraqis were members of the Ba'ath Party. There were 27 million Iraqis, so that would give you 2.7 million members of the party. But the draft of the debathification decree, which was done before I came into the government, before I was recalled, the draft was drafted such that it affected only 10% of the 10%. So it wound up being 1% of a tenth of Iraqi population, some 27,000 people total. Mm-hmm. But what it said was the people in that party had to leave the party and they had to get out of the government, but they were free to do whatever they wanted to economically. They set up a newspaper, they have a radio broadcast if they wanted to, they can open a business, but they couldn't stay on top jobs in the government, and it affected the top people. And during the decree also made it possible for me to issue plenary override and allow people to stay in a ministry if we felt his or her presence there was very important. For example, the people who did the administration of these ministries would be the only place you could get an order of who are the people, what is their salaries. So we kept I made scores of exceptions to let people stay in. The idea which has been written about that this somehow collapsed the Iraqi government is simply nonsense. Unlike most journalists, I regularly visited all 25 Iraqi ministries, and they were full of dedicated Iraqi civilians who were doing their job. What collapsed, what made them less efficient was this: there was no national telephone system. You couldn't pick up the phone in Baghdad and call somebody in Tikrit unless you worked for Saddam Hussein. There was no automatic transfer of funds in the banking system. You couldn't ask a bank in Baghdad to send some money to Mosul unless they put it in a car and drove it there. There were no computers in any ministry I saw except the Ministry of Information. So you had basically no modern capability in these ministries. You have to also remember that because our troops did not have orders to suppress the looting that came when Baghdad fell to the army, many of the ministries had been physically destroyed by looting. For example, the Ministry of Interior, which obviously was a hated ministry from Baghdad, from Saddam's time, was pretty much destroyed. The Ministry of Finance, which is the most important ministry in the government, had room for only half of the staff. So for the next 14 months, the most important ministry had to work in shifts because there was no place to put half of the people. So it's important to recognize that, and we'll come back at the end about how Baghdad is today. The enormous response that we got from the Iraqi government people who were not subject to de-Baathification. Now, I will confess to one mistake. I made the mistake of handing the preliminary implementation of this narrowly drawn decree. I turned it over to Iraqi politicians, and that was a mistake because then they started using it to score their get-even points with people they didn't like in the government. Mm-hmm. And I had to take the authority back to the coalition. But on the whole, it was absolutely essential to the long-term stability of Iraq that we outlaw the Ba'ath Party.
Thank you. You quickly followed CPA Order 1 with CPA Order number 2, the dissolution of entities. Why was this order necessary, and did the sudden massive numbers of unemployed military-age males contribute to the insurgency?
Well, first of all, one minor lexicological mistake was using the word disbanding, because actually there was no army. So we need to talk about what is the nature of the army, what was the status of the army, and what were the choices going forward with the army. Sure. First of all, the nature of the army is important to keep in mind. It's something that most Americans would find quite shocking, and they should. You're talking about an army of roughly 700,000, of which some 300,000 were draftees. This was not a volunteer army. This was a drafted army. Of those 300,000, most of them were Shia. The officer corps, which was, if you could do the math, slightly larger actually than the draftees. The officer corps was predominantly Sunni, both Kurd and Iraqi and Arab Sunnis. The army officers abused, brutalized, and dealt very roughly with the enlistees. The army had been Saddam's main instrument of suppression of the Kurdish who live in the north of Iraq in a what the UN called a genocidal war against Kurds, including the use, by the way, of chemical weapons against his own civilians. So we knew that Saddam had used weapons of mass destruction. The army was also used to suppress a Shia uprising in the south, which took place after the first Gulf War. I'll tell you, Ben, the first week I was there in Iraq, I went down to a town called Hilla, about 40 miles south of Baghdad, where our army had just uncovered the first of many mass graves. Some 30,000 people were in that mass grave that I saw at Hilla. Over the next 14 months, we would find more than 300 other mass graves in various parts of Iraq. This is how Saddam used his army. So this was the nature of the army. Now, the status of the army. The status of the army was there was no army. That's why disbanding was the wrong term.
Mm.
General Abizaid, the man I mentioned a little earlier, stated in early April that there was not a single unit of Saddam's army standing to arms anywhere in the country. In other words, when everybody saw which way this war was going against Iraq, they deserted. The Shia grabbed their guns, took whatever they could find in the barracks that interested them, maybe a window or a door, and went home. So the status of the army meant that the real question, which is the third question, is what do we do? Do we recall the old army? Do we build a new army? Well, some of our military officers at a lower level were talking around about recalling the army or elements of the army. When the Kurds heard that, they called me to come see them in Kurdistan, and I flew up to talk to them, and they made very clear to me that if we recalled the army, the Kurds would secede from Iraq. Now, Iraq, that would lead to an immediate civil war. They'd already had wars between the Kurds and the Shia and Sunnis in the 80s when Saddam used that army to conduct genocide. So if they said, if you call them back, we're going to secede, which certainly would lead to a civil war, quite possibly to a larger regional war because of the Kurdish interests in other countries. The Shia, who were cooperating with us under instructions from Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, had the same reaction. They said, those are the guys, that's the army that killed tens of thousands of Shia back after the first Gulf War. We can't tolerate that. So it was clear to us, and in fact, this decision was made before I came back in the government, that we would not recall the army. We would rebuild the army or build a new army. And that is what we did. We started training the 1st Battalion right away. We issued severance payments, one-time severance payments to all of the draftees. And we put all but the top officers in the old army on pensions that were calculated to be twice the level they would have gotten from Saddam Hussein. Mm. Now, I don't deny that it's possible that a number of these, particularly the officer corps, eventually went over and joined the dissidents, the terrorists as they became. Mm-hmm. If they did that, it wasn't because they didn't have a choice. They could have gone off and lived on their pensions or spent the money putting together a business for, I don't know, refrigerators, whatever.
Sure.
And I would add that at one point in April 2004, the Marines, without coordination with the civilian authority, recalled a battalion of the former army to help them try to subdue an uprising in Fallujah in the western Anbar province. That battalion went in at the Marines' request to the town of Fallujah and immediately went over to the enemy and became part of the problem. So the idea of recalling the army simply didn't take place. And the army that we trained, is the army that eventually defeated Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2009.
That's right. Okay, so looking back, the August 2021, I'm going to make a comparison here. The August 2021 withdrawal of coalition forces from Afghanistan was a disaster on a political, humanitarian, and strategic level. The Taliban rolled into Afghanistan, as we know, and unopposed and quickly reestablished an Islamist government. On the other hand, conversely, Iraq's democratic institutions, though deeply flawed, remain intact today. Why do you think the Iraqi government remains intact despite so many challenges? In other words, what distinguishes Iraq from Afghanistan?
Well, actually, by coincidence, I lived in Afghanistan for 2 years, long, long time ago. It was my first foreign posting back in the 60s. But I'm not an expert about Afghanistan nor about Iraq. But I think the thing that made the big difference was exactly what President Bush foresaw, which was to give the Iraqis a chance to establish representative government, which we did. The Iraqis wrote a constitution themselves, wasn't written by us, which they then put to a referendum and which was approved by the votes of some 12 million Iraqis. And they lived under that constitution, which provides for separation of powers, balance of power between parliament and the legislature and the executive. Mm-hmm. We established the independence of the judiciary as part of our work as a coalition. So the Iraqis had exactly what President Bush foresaw them having, which was a constitutional road to representative democracy. They've had 6 democratic elections since 2005 and 6 successive peaceful transfers of power to prime ministers. I don't deny that there's a lot of problems in Iraq today, but they had a lot of success.
Critics, again, of the Iraq War would argue that today Iraq is merely an extension of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Do you think this is a fair assessment? And did you experience any early signs that Iraq would fall into Iran's orbit?
But let me start with the second question.
Sure.
The Iranians were very, very quiet and not active when I was there. I think undoubtedly the leaders of Iran at that time had much in mind the fact that by 2003 they had a large American army on their eastern border with Afghanistan and a larger American army to the west in Iraq. And they had been labeled, along with Saddam, as the axis of evil. So the American intelligence, I think, showed that this was the period in which the Iranians cut back if they didn't stop their own effort to get nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. I'm not privy to that intelligence itself, but that's what I understand the situation was. So there was no early signal that the Iranians were very active while I was there. It is certainly the case, at least from what I read and hear, that they are more active now in Iraq than they were before, and that should be that needs to be taken seriously.
Sure. Next, I'd like to ask, how do you feel about the idea of nation building and democratization today?
Well, nation building and democracy, the promotion of democracy, is pretty central to the American dream, the American deal we made in the end back in 1776. After all, it was about democracy. We were suffering, not greatly, but suffering as a colony under a monarchy. So it's kind of in our bloodstream, this idea. We've been successful most of the time for 240 years. Where it's possible, we should always be in favor of representative government, whether you call it democratic. I always use the word representative just to make it clear that we didn't have a preferred path other than that the people should choose their government. And if you go back to our Declaration of Independence, we say that all individuals have those rights, and that's been pretty consistent in American history. So I would say I feel that it is a good thing to have, and from personal experience, it's damn hard to make it happen.
Sure. You mentioned the Kurds earlier, negotiating with them about the Iraqi military. In a 2017 interview with Kurdistan 24, you called the Kurdish Peshmerga the most consistent and capable allies to American interests in Iraq. What did you mean by that comment?
Well, the Peshmerga, which is the name they used for their independent Kurdish forces, who were very substantial and very capable, very well trained. They had worked under American training supervision between the two wars, between the first war and the second war. And so we had a great deal of experience, and they had a great deal of experience of our military working together, which gave their political leaders, the Kurdish political leaders, substantial weight in discussions about the future of Iraq. They had, after all, been essentially running the Kurdish region themselves for most of those 12 years. They had more experience in running government ministries than anybody in Baghdad, because the people in Baghdad had been working directly for Saddam Hussein on a different sort of set of different matrix. Mm-hmm. So the Kurds had experience in semi-autonomy that was really very much ahead of anybody else, which is what I meant by what you quoted me in that interview.
Sure. Okay, in our last about 5 minutes here, I want to shift focus from Iraq to terrorism. You served as the coordinator for counterterrorism at the State Department from 86 to 89. Many Americans tend to view Islamist terrorism within the limits of the post-Cold War era in the war on terror. Yet America faced very unique challenges during the 1980s from a very determined enemy. Tell us about the terrorist threat during your time at the Bureau for Counterterrorism. What sets this period apart from the threat we face today?
But if you look at terrorism, it first really surfaced, Arab-sponsored terrorism surfaced in the after the war of 1967 with the hijackings that took place in the early 70s. But terrorism then became more prevalent actually as an element of communism than it was Islamism. If you looked at the terrorists who were active in the 70s and 80s, the ones that I was dealing with in France, Belgium, Italy, Germany, they were basically Marxists who were seeking to make a point, and they made their point by killing not hundreds of thousands, but dozens of innocent people at a time. Usually their intention was to draw attention to their political manifestos. So the shift started to come in the 80s with the Marine Corps barracks bombing in 1983 by Hezbollah, right, and subsequent some other attacks, including Pan Am 103, which was at the end of the decade, 1988. I chaired the National Commission on Terrorism in the 1990s, and we focused on this shift very intently and said to the President and the Congress and the people of America in our report in June of 2000 that we faced a new, very virulent and much more serious threat from Islamic extremism, because these terrorists wanted to kill us, as we said in our report, by the hundreds of thousands. And indeed, the intention of the first of the World Trade Center bombings had been to kill 250,000 people, we found, because we captured the people who conducted that attack. So there was a big shift from the 80s into the 90s, and that's the one we still face today.
Were there any signs during that time that there would one day be a spectacular attack, coordinated attack on U.S. soil? That they were looking in this direction?
Yes, the first World Trade Center bombing was in 93. Yeah. And that was the intention, to topple one building into the other and kill 250,000 people. We had attacks on a army base in Jordan. We had attacks on the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. All happened at the end of the 80s. These were mass attacks, or with the intention of mass casualty attacks.
Sure. So very quickly here in our last minute, again, looking back, how do you assess the war on terror today? There hasn't been another 9/11, but the threat certainly exists. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we're better equipped to meet it now. We've had some unfortunate experiences in how we learned those lessons. But I think the coordination, particularly among the State Department, the Defense Department, and the intelligence community, is much better than it was 20 years ago. And the threat is certainly still there, particularly one needs to be worried about the Iranians now. But we have tools which we can use that we didn't have 20 years ago.
Sure. That's about all the time we have today. I want to thank our guest, Mr. Paul Bremer, for taking the time to assess the early Iraq War with us. It's been a fascinating and engaging discussion with you here today. I also want to thank our audience, of course, for tuning in today and staying subscribed to the Middle East Forum's menu of webinar offerings. If you have any questions about this interview today, please feel free to email me at action@meforum.org. Again, that's action@middleeastforum.org. And a reminder that you can find all of our webinars on the Middle East Forum's YouTube channel, on our website, and posted to our social media pages. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Ben.